Hi, everybody. Thank you for making it today. And for those of you listening in the future, thanks for making time for this. It's going to be a great learning experience. Angela is a bunch of things, but the way I think of her is she embodies, in many ways, the ultimate professional in terms of that she's a professor, she is a researcher, and most importantly, she is also a practicing executive coach. And why I'm excited about that is a lot of people are really great with their heads, but actually when they're talking about coaching, they're clueless, which is annoying. And so I just love that Angela lives and embodies, as it were, coaching. So she is an assistant professor right now at she's a professor of management at the college in Charleston. She's doing a bunch of research, which you'll hear about, which is just incredibly interesting and useful. She has the coaching chops that we've talked about, and she's published her work in a bunch of places. And you all know that the Institute awards grants, research grants, and they're very hard to get. And Angela got one in 2012. So, Angela, why don't you begin?
Thank you, Carol, for the warm welcome and for your kind words. You described me pretty well. In fact, almost exactly how I was going to describe myself. So I'll get to that in just a moment. But I have to say first that I'm really honored to be here today to share with you a bit about our work on vision-based coaching. And this isn't just my work. I'll explain a little bit more about the people who are involved. And I'm lucky to be here kind of representing the thinking and the work that we do collectively together. But as Carol mentioned, I wear three hats professionally. I'm a professor, a teacher, a researcher, and a practicing coach. So as someone who spends a lot of my time asking questions and listening and thinking and writing, it is quite a daunting task to think about how to speak for an hour to an invisible audience on a webinar. So I'm going to do my best to try to keep it engaging today and lean on Carol and Stephanie to kind of keep my inner scientist in check and let me pause when there are questions and add dialogue to our session today. So in our time together, what I'm hoping to do is share with you a little bit of the theoretical foundation for vision-based coaching after defining what that means. Introduce a little bit of the growing evidence base, the research, and then talk about how you implement vision-based coaching in practice. So these are the folks who I alluded to who are part of this, I guess, growing inquiry around vision-based coaching. And it's true, it takes a village to make some of these things happen, because as you have heard, we won the grant in 2012, and we're still working on publications from that 3 years later. So doing this kind of research isn't a quick and easy job, and it takes a number of us. And so some of the folks here you'll see and maybe know of Richard Boyatzis, who's pictured there in the center. He certainly is one of the motivating forces behind our work, and many of the theoretical perspectives I'll explain are built on his research. Ellen Van Oosten, who is in the upper left, is the now executive director of a newly launched coaching research lab at Case. Going clockwise, Melvin Smith, Scott Taylor, and a great partnership with a cognitive neuroscientist, Tony Jack, who you can tell from the brain images behind him, are all part of this work. So I just wanted to take a moment to share the credit before we dive in.
Angela, I'd like to make a comment, which
Absolutely.
is that middle picture. You can go back for a sec. Richard, if you all are interested in knowing more about Richard's work, you may not know that he's presented at the coaching conference that is the last Friday and Saturday of September every year. And there are pictures of his conference, and we have the entire thing in our library. But if you also go to our master classes, we have very extensive master class with Richard where we have papers that are translated. There are videos of him doing interviews. It's really great resource, so much so we turned it into 2 master classes. So you can find that under master classes in the website.
Excellent. Thank you for those extra resources. So let's dive in and answer the burning question. What is vision-based coaching? So vision-based coaching isn't rocket science. It's really pretty simple. Vision-based coaching is a process of coaching that emphasizes the ideal self as the driver of change, or the driver of the developmental process. And we're going to unpack what this idea of the ideal self actually is. But let me start with a little bit of an explanation. Because for many of us, myself included, our work as coaches is driven by a desire to help and a need at times to be able to demonstrate return on investment and the value that we're adding. For those reasons, sometimes we conflate helping with fixing. And so we begin our coaching process with a search for problems to be solved or goals to be achieved. We start with 360 feedback, and this puts the focus of coaching on the problem rather than on the person. And so vision-based coaching just adds a twist to what we commonly do as coaches that puts our focus back on the person as they explore the question, who do I really want to be? And so some of you may be thinking, as you see those glasses, this is using visualization techniques or imagery. It's more than that, and we will talk about that. That may be a part of vision-based coaching, but really vision is about creating an image of the ideal future for the leader in a holistic way. And it's really a pretty simple idea, and it seems like common sense to many of us, but it's really not common practice at this point. And so I want to just share with you a little bit of the background that leads us there. I mean, actually, before I do, just so I can get a sense of the audience and we can try a little technical experiment, Stephanie's going to help me here. How many of you, based on what I just described as vision-based coaching, knowing that that's a high-level definition, how many of you would say that you use visioning as part of your typical coaching engagement? And Stephanie, maybe you can direct us as to how to respond to that.
Yeah, sure. So I've just launched the question, and I see that we have almost 75% of our participants voting. And the outcome is 98% agree with that statement.
Awesome. So I am in good company here today. And so hopefully what I can do is just provide for you a little bit of the science behind it, talk to you about why we think it works and when it doesn't, what's going on, and then just share with you some of the techniques that, that we use in vision-based coaching. So our approach really is grounded on 3 core beliefs or assumptions. And the first of those is that leaders are whole people. Leaders have, or our clients, maybe for some of you they aren't leaders, maybe you're wellness coaches or your coaching clients aren't formal leaders, you maybe don't identify that way, but leaders or our clients are whole people. They have complex external and internal lives that extend beyond the walls of the office. Their identities include more than just who they are as a professional. They include their families, their faith commitments, their communities, their mental and physical health, and all of those things tie into their hopes, aspirations, fears, and concerns that are embodied in the neurobiological footprint that we'll talk about. A second assumption after leaders are whole people. Why can I not advance? Is that the way of development, the change process, is not a linear process. So many of times we go into change thinking that it looks like this. It's a direct line from where we are now to where we want to go. But probably for many coaches, you know, and for those going through a developmental process, they realize that actually change looks more like this, pretty messy and nonlinear and complex. So we also assume and believe that development is really quite messy and punctuated with twists and turns along the way. And assumption 3 is that adults sustain effort toward change that they truly desire. So what helps us persist in the face of adversity is an ideal image of a preferred future. very few people make lasting change in their lives based on mandates. So the work of vision-based coaching is to inspire change, not to mandate compliance. So that's why vision-based coaching begins with a thorough exploration of the ideal self. Don't be afraid of this model that I just put up there. I'm going to explain it quickly, briefly, and that's all you'll need to know. So, many coaches, well, I think good coaching means that you're able to explain to the client the process that you're using as you're going through coaching. And so the intentional change theory is a theoretical model that we use that underpins our work, and it's also the theoretical model that we test scientifically. And so the first discovery you'll see at the top is the ideal self. We spend a lot of time helping people get out of the present and sort of pause from the hectic day-to-day and learn about, rediscover what it is they're really truly passionate about, how they see themselves in the future, and what are the parts of themselves they want to carry forward. That provides an anchor for the rest of the process. So it looks so messy because all of these steps are interconnected. So after this first discovery of the ideal self is the real self. At that point, it's about understanding an accurate assessment of who you are, both how you view yourself and how others view you. So this is a great point at which to introduce 360 feedback or some other self-awareness focused intervention. The problem with beginning with the real self is that we know that a real self is someone's strengths and their weaknesses or their gaps. But as soon as we introduce 360 feedback or talk about the real self, this well-documented negativity bias focuses our energy on the gaps and the weaknesses, and the strengths fall by the wayside. Sometimes, no matter how hard a coach works to elicit an understanding of the strengths. And so having the ideal self first is a way to sort of buffer against that negativity bias that can be a part of the real self. Then from the real self, it's building a learning agenda that will move you closer to your ideal, to close the gap between your real and your ideal. This is where goals come into place, goal setting and action plans. And then the fourth discovery is putting those action plans into practice, trying new things, experimenting with new behaviors, seeing what responses those bring about, and eventually creating new habits that are lasting. And this process of the ideal self, the real self, the learning agenda, and practice and experimentation with new behaviors all revolve around the fifth discovery, which is a set of trusting relationships, which hopefully you as the coach are one of those. And you may also help the client identify others who fall into the supportive category who can help them with their developmental journey. So let's talk a bit more about what the ideal self is and how we define it. So the ideal self is comprised of really two main components. One is core identity, values, traits, the social contexts that have been part of your history and will be part of your future that you value and want to maintain. The second component is the ideal image of the future. A person's dreams, aspirations, what they're passionate about, their purpose, the legacy they'd like to leave behind. And getting really clear about those two things creates an emotional driver hope, or other positive emotions that gives motivational energy to the ideal self. And so we believe, and we have some research to suggest, that spending time in the ideal self elicits a mind-body state that we call the positive emotional attractor. So I'm about to throw some big words at you, so if you're at home and you have a notepad by you, I would suggest making a column, folding the paper in half and making 2 columns, and I'm going to give you some notes to keep a cheat sheet beside you so that you can follow along with me, and I'll try not to make this too complex. Some of these scientific words I know can be somewhat overwhelming. So these emotional attractors are mind-body states that help us move through the intentional change process. We need both. We need to experience both the positive and the negative emotional attractor. And as you can imagine from the labels, one would say that they're value-ridden, that the positive is positive, the negative is negative. And to some extent that's true, but the negative also has a role in helping to ground us. So let me talk a little bit about what these are. So the positive emotional attractor, we say that we're coaching to the PEA, or positive emotional attractor, so you might want to put that as a title in one column, when we're tapping the ideal self, when we're focusing the client's energy on dreams, aspirations, core identities. This, as I mentioned before, generally triggers a host of positive emotions, and in particular, experiences of hope, compassion, so thinking about the people who have helped you become who you are today, mindfulness, which can be both heightened self-awareness, but it can also be some of those techniques for those of you who may use breath work or mindfulness meditation techniques with your clients. That can also create this PEA state, positive emotional attractor state. And then playfulness and fun. Humor can also create a PEA state. So again, the positive and negative emotional attractors are states. They change fairly rapidly based on experience. So again, going back to the PEA, it taps the ideal self, triggers positive emotions, and it creates a bodily state that has a dominant influence of the parasympathetic nervous system. So don't be afraid of that. Cheryl and I were talking last week, and I said my easy way to remember this when I first started studying it was just to link the P and the P. Positive emotional attractor, PEA, with parasympathetic nervous system. And this is the part of the autonomic nervous system, which is our body's unconscious reaction that maintains homeostasis. It's part of that system that is responsible for our rest and digest response. It helps us to put the brake on when we're stressed. It helps us to be able to engage in social communication. It heightens our ability to listen, to see and make eye contact, to vocalize, to use those aspects of communication that are important in connecting. So you can see why in a coaching situation, getting someone into a state where they're under dominant influence of the parasympathetic nervous system would be so important, so that they are sort of optimized from a bodily perspective to be open to the coaching process. And you can kind of hopefully appreciate that in the figure there, that it's green for a reason. It's turning them on, the client's leaning forward, it's having a neurological effect that then trickles down to the rest of the body. On the other hand, the negative emotional attractor often happens, but not always, often happens when you're in the part of the coaching cycle that is focused on the real self, and that's because of that negativity bias. It can be a little bit threatening to talk about those things that we don't do well, or that could be potential derailers. And when the NEA, or negative emotional attractor, is really strong, it triggers negative emotions like shame and guilt, anxiety, that sometimes can motivate behavior, but generally aren't a sustainable way to motivate behavior for the long term. And the bodily impact of coaching in a way that evokes this particular state is that the sympathetic nervous system is activated, more so than the parasympathetic. And that part of the nervous system is responsible for your fight or flight response. Sending your bodily resources to your extremities, taking blood away from the brain to where you're not thinking so well, you're just acting on impulse, and readying you to either get out of there, get yourself out of the situation, or prepare to fight. This is the body's accelerator. The green side, the parasympathetic, puts the brake on that accelerator. So if you're making notes, I would just kind of put what is red on this slide on one side and what's green on this slide on the other, and keep that beside you as we go through this conversation. That way you won't have to refresh your memory on which one was sympathetic, what's PEA, NEA. And here, one last thing to note is that the coaching to the PEA, we've often called, if you are familiar with any of Richard Boyatzis' work, we've often called that coaching with compassion, because it's really coaching to the person. And we've called coaching to the negative emotional attractor coaching for compliance, because it's coaching to the problem. It's about fixing a little more so. And so coaching to the PEA is also the focus here of vision-based coaching. Vision-based coaching puts clients in a PEA state more often, more frequently than the NEA state. And I have to just make a note there that the NEA state plays a role. I mean, there are times when you need to focus and you need to be aware of those things that are mild threats. And sometimes a mild threat can actually create a bodily state that's challenged and ready for behavior. But there's a fine line and a tipping point to where that challenge state becomes a threat state. And the threat state, it shuts people down. It paralyzes them, and it stops the change process. So you have to really be careful about the ratio and tune in to the person's state, physiological state. So this is a little model that captures the ratio as we try to use it as a guide. So here's where I'd like you to use that question button and tell me, what do you notice about this model that might provide a rule of thumb for the ratio between the PEA and NEA in coaching, in vision-based coaching? So Carol and Stephanie, are you seeing responses?
Well, I think if you, I don't know if it was explained quite correctly, but if you just want to ask that again and then have people write in their response. So I'm not popping up a poll question, which I think some people might be expecting.
No. So in the question, we're asking, I mean, they can respond where they would normally ask a question.
Exactly.
Okay, so where you would normally ask a question, instead of a question, give me a statement that says what you notice about the model here that may give you an indication about the ratio between the positive to negative emotional attractor.
Angela, now you're receiving a bunch of responses. So are you seeing these, or would you like me to read them out loud?
I see a few. Actually, I only see two here.
Would it be helpful?
Stephanie, I'm not getting any at all. I can't see them, so you may want to turn on whatever it is at some point. Oh, they've come up. Thanks.
Right, so I'm seeing here a couple of 5-to-1 and 3-to-1, so that is great. These are folks who are probably familiar with Barbara Fredrickson's work on the ratio of positive to negative emotions in folks who thrive versus folks who survive, and I think that's a good rule of thumb. So we don't know for sure what the exact ratio is, if it's 5-to-1, 6-to-1, 3-to-1, but we know that you need relatively more PEA than NEA, and it's probably greater than twice as much. Anything else that you notice? I think I'm only able to see 3 at a time here.
So Angela, I'm passing some of these on to Carol, and you're right, most people are responding with that ratio.
Yeah, I think, Angela, that our audience is pretty sophisticated, actually, because everybody here seems to notice it. And the one thing I love, though, is that the green circle isn't bigger, and that if it gets much bigger, you're just as ineffective as if it's too small.
Right, certainly. So there's a point of diminishing return where you're no longer grounded. So you don't want to overdo the vision component or the PEA component. You also, if you're reading from left to right, the PEA comes first. So I want you to notice that. Another rule of thumb is the PEA should be first. It's much harder to get someone into that positive emotional state and to think about the ideal or the future once they're already in a negative emotional place, or once they're already really dug into the details of the current moment. So the order is one piece, and then very simply the color. You know, positive emotion turns people on. The red, negative emotion, shuts people down. So that's just a small representation that we use to think about how do we negotiate the relationship or the ratio between PEA to NEA moments in coaching. So we believe that there are a number of benefits to vision-based coaching. For the individual, it accelerates the formation of a positive coaching relationship, which we all know is so essential to the outcomes of coaching. It facilitates identity expansion, particularly in the area of leader identity. It increases vitality, both health and wellness, but also psychological and mental vitality. It activates learning-oriented goals, and we'll talk a little bit more about those. I'm sure that many of you have already been introduced to that idea, learning versus performance. And it fosters a motivational stance that's promotion-oriented. And again, we'll say a little bit more about that. And we believe that even though we're focused on the individual, there are some benefits to organizations of this type of coaching. It increases engagement, commitment, and retention in the organization. It promotes pro-social behavior and pro-social helping behaviors at work, going above and beyond the call of duty, and creates a culture of development, because these kind of conversations are catchy. They spread like a virus. and I think, you know, many of you may be able to identify with this, after you've had someone ask you these questions and really invest in you as a person and in your future, you want to do it for someone else. And so we find that these leaders are having vision-based conversations, who we work with, vision-based conversations with their direct reports, with their spouses at home, with their children. And so there's a ripple effect, a contagion effect that we believe is happening with vision-based coaching. So now let me move to share with you a little bit of the evidence. So there's been quite a bit of research coming out, mostly of, well, there's a lot of coaching research overall that's fantastic. I'm going to focus on some of the work that I've been a part of, and particularly coming out of Case Western Reserve University. So we have done 2 neuroimaging studies where folks have gone through a coaching process, and then we put them in a magnet, an functional magnetic resonance imaging machine, and take images of their brain as they respond to video clips of their coaches. And the Heart of Helping study, which is the study that was funded by the Institute of Coaching. And this was using a similar paradigm, but we were taking the measures in real time rather than in a fMRI environment. So I want to tell you just a little bit about the paradigm that we used for all 3 of these studies. So folks would come in and experience 2 different coaching sessions. And sometimes they experienced differing numbers of each, but they experienced at least one of each with different coaches. And these were professional coaches who were trained in this protocol. And for the PEA protocol, and when I say PEA, that's also vision-based coaching.
Oh dear.
What do you hope?
Angela, you were gone. We couldn't hear you for the last 20 seconds or so.
Oh, I'm sorry. From the paradigm, shall I start?
Yeah, you were saying that people came in and they experienced either they had like one of these vision-based coaches, or they had a more what problems are you solving coaches.
Right.
Either at least one of those options, and sometimes both.
Yeah, well, always both, but sometimes they had 2, 3, or even 4 PEA sessions. And the important thing is to know they had one of each with two different coaches, with the idea of trying to isolate these two different kinds of conversations, understand what's happening when we ask those questions as coaches so that we can better be able to manage a coaching process. Not necessarily to say one's better than the other, but how should we order the process if we need both. And so we were really trying to experimentally understand and examine what are the emotional and neurobiological responses that clients have to these kinds of coaching approaches. What effect does it have on the quality of the coaching relationship, because we know how important that is, and what effect does it have on goal-related behavior? So I'm going to tell you just a little bit about these studies, and then we will talk a bit more about implementation in practice. So don't be afraid again of this image. What you're seeing here is a brain as if you were looking at the front of someone's head and they had reached their hands behind their head and kind of peeled the head open from the back. So we're looking at the...
Charming image, thank you.
Yeah. I'm sure that's
I'm now in
when you're coaching, right?
my NEA, thank you.
Well, okay. I'm not sure how to bounce back from that.
Move on.
Right. So what's interesting here is what you see is frontal asymmetry, where the blue in the brain is the part of the brain that's active when a person is interacting through video with someone who they've had an NEA conversation with, a coach who they've had an NEA conversation with. And the orange are the parts of the brain that are active when those same individuals are viewing videos of a coach who they've had a vision-based coaching conversation with. And what you see here is pretty interesting. These asymmetries, where there's more blue here on the right hemisphere, is often associated with negative emotions and avoidance motivation. So that is the motivation to try to avoid negative outcomes. And let me give you an example of this. So I was working with a client some time ago who was a middle manager, worked for a fantastic company, loved his office, loved the people there, but was really, he had outgrown his role, and there wasn't anywhere else to go. And several years he had not gone up for a promotion because he knew that it would mean moving to a different office, and he was afraid he wouldn't like the culture as much as he liked being at that particular office. And he said, it's worth it to me to feel a little stagnant in my position to not take the risk of not liking this future. And so he was in this NEA state of fear about what could possibly go wrong in the future and what he wanted to avoid. And so my work as a coach was to help him open up and see possibility in another opportunity, and how to maybe handle and reframe some of those fears. And so working through the PEA is what you see, those orange spots on the other side of the brain, the left hemisphere, are usually associated with positive emotions and approach motivation, where you're motivated to approach the outcome that you really want. And so for this client who I was working with, we started to think about what are the possibilities that would await him. If you were to take a position, because he had been offered an opportunity, they wanted him to put his name in the hat, and pretty much would have, he was the first candidate, he would have gotten the job. We started talking about his dream to move closer to family and be in a warmer climate, and how did some of these variables play in, and how can we reframe your fears about culture as an opportunity to be an influencer and to change culture through your leadership role. And so eventually it took some time and work, envisioning work about what could this look like. Eventually he kind of switched modes and was able to put his name in the hat and got the job, and was terrifically pleased with the outcome of this big question that he had. And so those two, I'm not sure that I want to do this because of what could go wrong, versus here are all the possibilities that this could hold, and I'm aware of what could go wrong, but I am motivated by the possible and tempered by what could go wrong. That's sort of what you're seeing here play out. So a coach who's coaching to this NEA is putting someone in that fear space. A coach who's coaching to the PEA is putting them in a more possibility, approach-oriented, and positive emotional space.
So, Angela, I'd love to give a counter example for a moment,
Sure.
which is very often I work with pretty tough leaders who are, maybe they're very successful and not so quick to change or not so motivated to change. And then what I'll often do is activate the negative emotional attractor. I'll activate threat in terms of, look at, here's 360. This says that you are, perceived as a bully. Now, given what your goals are, is this serving you? So that activates the negative and the threat, because that then gets them interested in growing because they see an outcome that matters. So I think what we need to do is as you said, navigate both. And then once they've done that, to then go, well, actually I see that you have enormous skills of getting people, to really care about you and you care about them. Doesn't show up in this area. How can we borrow from that? And what would your vision be? So I go from the baseball bat to the encouraging, and again, in that 3-to-1 kind of ratio.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's that toggling back and forth that's important. What oftentimes we see get missed, particularly with coaches who are either inexperienced or managers who are coaching employees who aren't necessarily trained as coaches, is that they don't start with that, what's the goal? And I hesitate to call it a goal, because goals tend to be more instrumental and proximal as compared to what's the ideal.
Well, that's the vision.
More aspirational. Yeah, and you were able to say, as part of the use of threat, how does this serve the goal of, of the idea?
But even more than that, I think one thing you do in coaching, and that most of us do in coaching, is we establish the caring first. So
Right.
we are experienced as caring, so that when we activate the threat response, they're threatened about their challenge, but they're not threatened by us.
Right. Right. And there's some work, Wendy Mendez and Blaskovich have a model called the biopsychosocial model that suggests that, particularly in performance-oriented situations, there's these heightened states help people perform, and there's a difference, though, between a threat state and a challenge state. And the challenge state that is, you are activated in a way that would look a little bit like the NEA, it helps you to perform and move forward, whereas threat shuts you down. So there absolutely is a role for using those techniques.
And that's a good reason for not doing the 360 first.
Yeah.
You establish the relationship, et cetera, and then go to the reality.
Yeah, yeah. So I'm gonna show you some in a couple of slides here. I'm gonna show you some results of the relationship. In fact, why don't I just go forward to that slide and we'll come back to the emotions piece. So this was the results of the Heart of Helping study after each of the coaching sessions that these folks had, and the coaching sessions were spread out across a month, so they didn't have one coaching session and 3 days later the other. I mean, we really tried to isolate them. They met with different coaches, and after each session they filled out a host of surveys, one of which helped us to measure these various elements of the coaching relationship. So what degree did you trust your coach? How would you rate the rapport? How much interpersonal closeness do you feel? How much relational energy do you feel emanating from your coach? And relational energy is, how pepped up do you feel by this person? How energizing are they? How much did they motivate you? And these were all significant differences, statistically significant differences between the coach who coached in the vision-based coaching and the coach who started with what are the problems and goals we can work on. And so I think this is a pretty profound evidence of how important vision-based coaching can be for establishing that coaching relationship, and why starting with the ideal self is so important. It sort of builds that relational muscle that's necessary to sustain periods of disconnection, whether that's a little bit of threat or if that's difficult conversations, giving tough feedback, playing devil's advocate, doing some of those roles that may feel interpersonally or relationally risky. So let me go.
Great.
Yeah, I thought this was really robust. And it's not, we don't, in science you don't actually ask the person directly, do you trust him? There's a scale, 3 or 4, maybe 5 items that get to capture trust and capture rapport. So this is just the variable after it's been analyzed. So let me go back a bit to this emotion slide and share with you. In the fMRI studies, we were able to see what people can't self-report, what was happening in their brains, but that doesn't give us a lot of detail. So in the Heart of Helping study, we wanted to do this study in a more ecologically valid setting, a more realistic setting. And so we used a number of scales that would help us to understand these emotional responses in the brains that we saw. And using a really simple measure that's almost like an emoticon to describe happiness and satisfaction before and after each coaching session, we were able to see that the PEA coaching session, the vision-based coaching session, actually uplifted people. They were happier and more satisfied after the vision-based coaching session. After the NEA, the more problem-focused coaching session, they were actually emotionally dampened. So they were less satisfied walking out of that conversation than they were coming into that conversation. And after each coaching session, we also wanted to know, okay, so tell us more about the emotions that you're feeling. And so we had them respond to a very standard emotional measure called the positive affect and negative affect scale. And here you see the emotions that are associated with negative affect in red and positive affect in green. And almost all of them were significantly different between the two conditions. And what I thought was really interesting, so overall, the folks felt more positive affect after this vision-based coaching session and more negative affect relative to the other coaching session in the NEA session. But what was really interesting is the strongest differentiators between the two were that the clients reported feeling inspired and enthusiastic after the vision-based coaching session, and significantly more distressed after the NEA coaching session. So this gives us some pretty powerful information about the emotional impact of using these kinds of questioning techniques. So you can imagine, of course, then how sort of your emotional experience may impact the perceived quality of the coaching relationship. But then, of course, you have to get to, okay, where does the rubber hit the road? We need to, what are folks going to actually do as a result of coaching? And so we know that goal-related behavior is a big part of that. And so the last thing that folks did was to write a few goals in response to a prompt that was, based on your conversation with your coach, what goals do you have for your life and career, and why are they important? And we gave them as much time and as much space as they wanted to be able to respond to those questions. And folks were seemingly equally engaged in the two tasks. In either condition, they spent comparable amounts of time on both of them. They typed the same amount of words in both of them. But when we looked at what they actually said, they were qualitatively strikingly different. So those goals that were written in the PEA condition, is, not surprisingly, were much more aspirational. But they also had a much stronger element of compassion. The desire in my work in life to serve others and to help others. And the connection to those aspirations was heartfelt. I mean, they talked about it with love. And not about other people with love, but their goals with love. And in the NEA condition, as you might imagine, the goals were much more instrumental and proximal. You know, I just want to finish this MD and start working. There were concerns for external expectations. You know, I want to do something that other people approve of. They discussed prevention concerns. You know, I would love to go into this field, but I'm worried about having to find funding if I were to go into science and research. And they had generally a unidimensional focus where they were really only thinking about one dimension of their life, most often work, rather than a holistic picture of how their whole life goals, you know, connect and interrelate to one another. So here's another little test or illustration. Here, these are two examples of goal statements that were written, and I want you to see what, you don't have to actually respond out there using the question, but I just want you to see if you can identify the differences. Which one would be vision-based coaching, written after vision-based coaching, versus written after a more NEA or problem-focused type of coaching session. The first one, to be working as a clinical research associate with a management degree to ensure that creative ideas in clinical research get explored and get the right scientific study. Also to promote the sport of cricket, which is so close to my heart, and get it into the grassroots of the school systems. And then why is this important? It's something that I'm passionate about and what I see myself giving 100% of my creative mind to, cricket or my career goal. And the other one, now, I don't really have one particular goal in terms of my career. I suppose I want to have a job where I make enough money not to be worried about paying the bills. I think there are a number of paths I could take to that goal. So while I'm not super focused on my graduate work and doing well, so while I am super focused on my graduate work and doing well in my program, I don't really translate that to I must be a professor or else I'll never be happy. I feel very ambivalent about my future. These were quintessential differences between the two conditions, and as you might guess, the first one was vision-based coaching and the second was the problem-based conversation. And if you hadn't noticed, the folks who were participants in this particular study mostly were, I think the average age was about 28. They were all graduate students, and many of them in the STEM fields, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, and medicine. I would fall into that category. And so, interestingly enough, these two sessions had an effect on how they, the nature of the goals they set. And we also wanted to know, okay, how is it going to impact your likelihood of striving toward these goals? So we asked them some questions about goal striving. And we had them say, okay, based on what you've just wrote, list your top three goals that are most important to you, up to three. They didn't even have to write three. And then we had them rate various things about each of those goals. And so what we found was that following the vision-based coaching session, participants reported more goals that were of greater importance to them. They reported being more willing to expend effort toward those goals, even though sometimes they were the same exact goals they wrote about after the NEA session. And they reported that they would find the journey of goal striving to be more joyful. And so we think that certainly this will help people stick to the tough and arduous process of behavior change and becoming the ideal and who you truly want to be. So this is I'm going to wrap up here the science of it. This was kind of a deep dive into one study, but the conclusion here is that vision-based coaching inspires a host of resources inside an individual that will help in their developmental journey. And so the call is to make the ideal self a central part of the coaching process. Then for us who are practitioners, the question is, how do we do that? And so here I've just provided a number of questions that are PEA focused. And so I think the most important thing is to remember to begin the coaching process with an exploration of the ideal self. And you can approach that through various positive emotional experiences. So for example, hope, the question that we used in these studies. Imagine it's 10 years from now. How old will you be? How old will your children be? You know, really paint a picture of what 10 years might look like, and what would you love to be doing? Who would you love to be with? What impact would you love to be having? Ask them what they're passionate about. Compassion, you know, get them talking about people who are meaningful in their lives. Mindfulness, talking about values, and really concretely about what are the top 5 values that guide your life? Where do they come from? What are the roots of those values? How do you define them personally? What do you think about when you don't have to think about anything at all? What might be percolating in the back of your mind that you're not paying attention to that would make your life more meaningful and more full? Playfulness, just for fun. Let's not be too serious here. If money were no object and you could do everything at all, anything at all, what would you want to do with your time? Or think back to when you were a child and had the innocence of a child. What did you love to do? And extrapolate meaning for that and help them from that and help them try to put it together. All of this is in service of drawing out a personal vision. And the personal vision is really simply the symbolic representation of one's ideal self. It's answering 2 fundamental questions. Who do you really want to be, and what do you really want to do? And that no matter what point in time you meet a client in their career, there's always a future, even if that future is retirement, which for me has been some of the most interesting work I've been doing lately. And so you're really helping a person discover important parts of the whole, the being and the doing sides, and create some sort of articulation of that. And in our work, we actually, as the first step in the coaching process, have people produce a vision statement. And I use this in my classes. They've been using it at CASE for years, an extensive vision statement, you know, a vision and values essay that are sometimes 10 to 15 pages long. Executives probably don't have the bandwidth to do that, but we do encourage them to write a narrative, you know, have something that captures their thoughts, because getting the thoughts out of their head and onto paper helps to clarify them and to encourage commitment to them. And so we'll talk about sort of this larger narrative as one component of the vision statement, and then a 6 to 8 word headline as another component of that vision statement. And the vision statement evolves over time. And so if I have a coaching contract that has 6 sessions, we're spending probably the first 2 sessions really talking about that vision and creating it, honing it, refining it. But every conversation I have, at some point, we talk about the vision. And usually those evolve, or someone has an epiphany about something that's come into focus or clarity, and we talk about that in almost every session, along with other things, but that's an anchor for the coaching process. So I wanted to just bring you some examples of these, and I've gotten permission to share these that are quite different, because there's not really one correct way that we know of yet to do a personal vision. We know that we look for, you know, is it comprehensive and holistic? Does it capture many parts of the person's life? And is there salience? Do we know, is that person clear on what's the most important part of this vision in the chapter of life that they're in right now? So we do look for those 2 things, but they take many forms. And so this is a personal vision statement that was written by a male leader in education. And he said, he designed his vision statement almost like a creed, you know, that he can put on a wall to remind him who he is. I'm an educator, activist, change agent, father, son, brother, entrepreneur, spouse, leader, learner, lover, athlete, so on. I attract and construct career opportunities that allow me to serve a higher purpose. So this happened to be someone who was in between positions. And so at the time, that was really salient for him. I find enjoyment in my personal life through the witness of love that can be found every day in Earth's natural beauty, the love of learning, and the unconditional love of authentic relationships. And there are also some other things that he was sort of struggling with as a person at that time that he wanted to write about in an affirmative way. I'm immune to criticism, self-doubt, and fear. I will rise above it. I'm not afraid of any challenge, and I'm not below anyone. I'm here to serve. I'm here to inspire. I'm here to love. So this was something that was deeply meaningful for him. Another person who is a very senior banking executive took a completely different approach. And so she started with, well, she didn't start with this, but eventually identified this 6 to 8 word headline, leave a positive imprint on people's lives, that became really the focus of our conversations. That was that goal, Carol, that we could come back to. How does this help you leave a positive imprint? But she was fairly extensive, and she created a PowerPoint presentation. And these are just some of the headlines. And personal vision, my vision for me, my vision for my marriage, my vision for my family, my vision for my friendships. It's not done yet. My vision for my work relationships, my vision for my work group, my vision for my leadership, and vision for my community. And so, her approach, very different than the person before, but very meaningful to her. And of course, this is big. There's a lot here. So we had to really work on, okay, so what's important? What has to stay front of mind? And that's where the headline comes from. And then a third that I just wanted to share, that she took a very artistic approach. This was a person who's an artist and works in nonprofit and in social change. And she wrote just an amazing metaphor for her vision statement and drew the most unbelievable images and pictures to go with it. I mean, I wish I would have taken pictures so I would still have them. I don't anymore, but so I have here one of the ones that was most touching to me. But she said, and I'll pull this out in case this is tiny on your screen. One of the components in her vision was, if as an old and wrinkled woman I can look at the cloth I have woven with my strong and elegant hands and see in it depth and texture and vibrant colors and durability, if I can recall sitting on a bench before my loom, rocking side to side, passing shuttles of yarn back and forth and listening to the wood creak as I worked rhythmically, creating cloth from what was single strands, uniting what was solitary, then I will know what I am here to do. And luckily, she offered an author's note that interpreted this longer vision statement. And for example, here she said, this image or metaphor signifies uniting communities and organizations and movements working for social change in ways that are lasting, vibrant, and respectful of each entity's true essence. And so her way of creating a vision was something much more artistic and metaphorical, but again, deeply, deeply meaningful to her. And so I would encourage you as a coach to be flexible and creative with the individuals that you're working with, seeing them as people and allowing them to kind of create what is best for them. And you can't rush the process. For some folks, this takes a long time. It's not easy to get it done all in one session, and sometimes you don't have that luxury. Sometimes it's a quick engagement and you only get 1 or 2 sessions, and so you do your best to draw out the ideal wherever you are. But if you have the time to really create something like this, it can be really powerful for folks. So I want to just offer some limitations, and then perhaps we can do some Q&A for the last 15 minutes. One thing to know about visioning and vision-based coaching is that visioning alone is likely insufficient. So we have some evidence to suggest that we're not so sure actually that goals are all that helpful, but we don't have scientific evidence to prove one way or another. We know that the vision can motivate behavior, at least for certain individuals, but we think that certainly visioning alone needs other processes in order to help create development and sustain change. And so visioning provides an anchor for some of those other discoveries in the intentional change process, but it isn't the intentional change process. It's just what's distinguishing about intentional change. So a couple of the other processes that have been documented in the scientific literature are mental contrasting. So that's this idea that behavior is really motivated from the contrast between the ideal and the real. So if you just have the ideal, it's almost like a fantasy that can sometimes fulfill a need, even though it's not actually happening. But when you can see the difference between that fantasy and what the reality is, then it creates a motivational energy that can underpin behavior. And then also process forecasting. This is important in particularly in athletics, and understanding, okay, how is this going to play out? I don't just see my perfect serve. I envision all of the steps in the process to serving that ace. And so this process forecasting would complement visioning by saying, okay, I see this end result. What do I need to do to take the steps to get there? So for example, I'm working with a client right now who is wonderfully charismatic in small settings, but really gets nervous speaking in front of large groups. And she's at a point in her career where she's being asked to do that. And so we spent a lot of time thinking about who she wants to be as a presenter and what's authentic for her, and not for the people who have had her role in the past, because she may do it differently. But a big part of that has to be, okay, what happens between now and that speech? And understanding, the steps along the way that will help her to get there. So one caution is that visioning alone is insufficient. The second caution is that, vision can be dysfunctional if someone gets stuck. So vision can be an escape fantasy where it's actually not really the ideal self at all. It's just a way to escape how horrible the present state is. And so being able to kind of tease apart, okay, is this person who wants to leave a successful career and buy a truck and become a trucker actually something that person wants to do and is part of who they are and what they've always wished to do, or is this just a way to get themselves out of a bad situation today? And so that's part of your work as a coach, to be able to tease those apart and identify, okay, what is it about driving a truck, driving cross country, hauling materials, that is what the client is searching for? What is it about that will tell me something about what their ideal really is? There's also some evidence used from our fMRI studies that in certain states in vision-based coaching, you can actually be too open and too scattered, and it can be difficult to focus when there are just possibilities and ideas and no funnel to help identify, okay, what's salient, what's really the focus here. So unfocused thinking can be a dysfunction of vision. And then, vision can also, if people are in a bad place, particularly with mental health, and by the way, in all the studies that I just described, we used mental health screening to make sure that we were doing no harm and make sure that only folks who were not at risk went through those kinds of conversations. But there may be places where visioning actually makes the situation worse because it encourages rumination on experiences from the past or from the future that are dysfunctional and painful, and so you have to tread lightly around that a little bit. And then also you may find some resistance to visioning. For some folks it's really hard, and especially, I've had a few clients who have had pretty severe illness in their family, a very successful female executive with an adult daughter who had children, her grandchildren, and who was an alcoholic. And that made thinking about the future really hard and really difficult. And so sometimes you have to kind of circumvent that future part of the ideal self and play on some of the other experiences of the PEA, gratitude, mindfulness, to help get them into the state that is so beneficial. And so I just wanted to offer, a little reality check about the limitations here of visioning. And with that, I will open it up to your questions and answers.
Thank you, Angela. It might take a little while for some of the questions to come in, but one thing that's also interesting is that even voice tone can trigger a kind of reaction. You think of the voice tone as a therapist who goes, how are you? Versus the voice tone of the coach who goes, how are you? And what that does. And I think the other thing that's really great is for probably most of the people listening, they already do this kind of coaching since we had 98%.
Yeah.
But what I love about learning this material is that it says that what I'm doing is congruent with massive amounts of really high-end research. And that's extremely, I think, supportive of what we're doing. So here is a question by Khalil. Thank you. The question, since the ideal self is often obscured or held hostage by the person's protective parts, how do you test that the ideal self is the authentic or the core self? So again, the complexity of this, you know, that someone may have this fake ideal self that a part of them is saying this is really who you must be. So so anyway, how do you know the ideal self is the real one?
Well, I think as a coach, there's a couple of levels there. One is really tuning in to the person's mind-body state and listening to their tone, looking at their body position, kind of checking in, you know, if you see their chest start to get red or maybe a little bit of sweat break out in their forehead, I mean, you know that is, they're in a situation maybe where they're caught between someone else's expectations of the ideal, we call that the ought self, and their ideal. Or if they are, you know, for some people, if you ask them about this question and they're really stuck and their ideal self is really held hostage, I mean, their eyes will well up with tears because no one has given them permission to step outside of the social expectations or outside of their own negative self-talk about who they are. And so I think, you know, a huge indicator is how that person physically is responding to you, the nonverbal signs. And then through your questions, you know, the way that if you can ask questions that really dig deeply into and help the person expand their thinking of those dimensions of the ideal self, you'll sort of quickly be able to identify, you know, how much of this is coming from you versus and who you want to be versus how much of this is being sabotaged by some other process happening.
That's great. That's great. Thank you. This is what's wonderful about having a real coach involved with this work rather than the kind of research. I mean, the research is so good, you could just be this really odd, wonky nerd. And instead, you can really go to the analytic side and the social side. So here's one question that is by, I'm not sure I'm going to say your name right, Anna Rob, or Rabe, or Robe, but Anna, thank you. Her question is, to limit triggering the NEA, do you recommend avoiding exploring possible future obstacles and what the client might do if the obstacle presents itself?
Oh, that's a great question. Both of these were great questions. And Anna, so I would say yes and no. Yes, you do have to really hold yourself back from exploring those obstacles at first because you don't want to impose limitations on someone's ideal self. The idea of the ideal self is that it's an aspiration. It doesn't have to be attainable, but someone can get darn close, or someone can create elements, craft small parts of it into their life. And so at first, you really do have to try to hold yourself back from helping them explore potential landmines or things that could get in their way. But as the coaching process moves on, if you don't explore those things, I think you're doing them a disservice. But at that point, you're toggling back and forth, you know, between this PEA state and this NEA state. But you have to have a really solid ideal self before you can start to say, you know, what are some of these constraints or obstacles that might get in the way of you achieving this. And actually, let me add one more thing about that. so many times if you're talking about achieving the ideal self, you probably aren't aspirational enough. So there'll be learning milestones between where a client is now and what that ideal looks like. And so you're probably going to be talking about a smaller milestone at first, not even achieving the ideal, but a step toward the ideal.
Right, moving towards it.
Mm-hmm.
So we have a question here from Christine Kress. Christine, thank you. And this is a bit long, but it's rich. So, Angela, her question is, what has been your experience with clients creating their personal vision? Do you ever go back to see if they want to rewrite it after several coaching sessions? Christine's experience is that there have been many coaching clients that have been so busy and overwhelmed with the to-dos that they almost wind up being blank. And they're not really able to connect with their personal vision until after several sessions. Mm-hmm. So what, two questions back then for me is sort of what do you think of that, and can you connect that to your brain research directly?
Oh, wow. So there were a lot of questions.
Yeah.
So you might have to fill me in a bit, Carol, but the first question I think that I heard here was,
what's
do
your
you ever go back?
Yeah, what's your experience creating and shaping the personal vision, and do you ever go back to see if they want to rewrite it?
Rewrite it, yeah. So, like I said, depending on how long you have to work with a client, and depending on where that client is, it takes a different amount of time for, it's a very individualized process. But I will say, in terms of creating the vision, but I will say that I often go back and check in to see, have you refined it at all? Have you rewrote it? And one thing that I recommend, and this isn't just coming from me, this is coming from a long history of coaches before me who taught me that never rewrite the vision statement. Always save a new version of it. So have them, if they're doing it in some way that they can, electronically and email it to you, have them create a new file with the date, and don't write over the old one, but write over the new one. And just recently, a good example of that is I'm working with an executive from a manufacturing company. He has 4 children, and he has a pretty significant role in this company. And at one point in time, when we first started talking, he was pretty burned out. He had just come off of leading one of the company's largest capital projects, a building that they built, and he was burnt out. And one of the things that we talked about quite a bit was another a company that he would like to start, a gym that would focus on men, building Christian men and their mind and body. And so we spent a lot of time talking about that. And I honestly think that was a little bit of one of those escape fantasies, which it wasn't exactly what he wanted to do at the end of his career. It might be what he wants to do in retirement. But he needed that time to just get away from work and visualize something. And so I said, well, let's just let this play out. So we talked about it our first couple of coaching sessions. 4 months later, he said, my wife and I were having a conversation, and I've come to realize how important it is for us to be able to pay for all 4 kids' college and for them to start off life debt-free. And I'm willing to make some sacrifices to make that happen. And so he rewrote a part of his vision about who he was as a father and how salient that was, because his first son had just been accepted to college. And so, I think that it absolutely they have to have a chance to rewrite it as different things become salient in their lives. And then, I'm sorry, you said, do you connect it to the brain research?
Yeah. We just have a couple minutes left, and let's hear how you connect this to the fMRI studies and where the brain is lighting up.
Specifically rewriting it, or just overall?
No, just sort of doing the vision statements, the gap, maybe a overall just summary in terms of the actual brain research and coaching.
Sure. Well, I would also like to share these are 2 unpublished findings, so take that with a grain of salt. But one finding from one of our recent fMRIs is that there's a part of your brain, the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, that is responsible for affective meaning making from cognitive information. And that part of the brain was increasingly more activated when a person interacted with the coach they had in the PEA based on how many coaching sessions they had around their vision. So the more coaching sessions they had around the vision, the more this brain area was activated when they were responding to this coach in the scanner. And what's really interesting about this is we also had a group of participants who responded to those same questions, but into a computer. So they didn't actually talk to a live coach. They answered the same questions, but into the computer. And that part of the brain was not active for those.
Wow.
Yeah. So
that's great. So
yeah.
Hold on a second. I just have to say what is brilliant about this is when you activate that part of the brain that connects affective meaning and cognitive information, you are really talking about head and heart working together.
Mm-hmm.
We certainly know from other brain research that people say that you can't activate both at once. People are either in analytic mode and that dampens down social, or you're in social and that dampens down analytic. And this is really saying vision-based coaching can really make your head and heart work together. And if you think about coaching as aligning people to really connect with who they are and move forward, that is a superb finding. And also, thank goodness you can't do it in a computer. But
Right.
you need the person there believing in you and connecting with you.
Yeah.
So
yeah. I think that the latter is
going to be
the most important point. Yeah.
Thank you for that. So we are now out of time. And Angela, thank you very much for sharing the research and your work with us. And why don't I let you have the last word?
Because you saw my last slide. You know, as I was looking for some pictures to make this more interesting than just my voice, I came across this quote from Steve Jobs, and I thought, this just captures it so perfectly. You know, it captures vision-based coaching so perfectly. And if you're working on something exciting that you really care about, you don't have to be pushed. The vision pulls you. And so I think as a parting thought, that's what I would like to leave you with.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Everybody, thank you for joining us. And those of you who are listening at some point in the future, thank you as well. And at the Institute, we really want to serve you. So let us know if there's other particular topics you would like for us to explore. Thank you, everybody. Stephanie, thank you too. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.